a.m. Eastern Time.
No one commands respect like Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin was a child gospel star in the 1950s who stormed the pop charts in the 60s and kept having hits in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Aretha became a symbol for black power, woman power, and soul power. She was honored by Dr. Martin Luther King. Aretha was the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She won 15 Grammys. But even while the world's glories piled up, Aretha faced tragedy after tragedy in her personal life.
R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, take F-T-C-T.
Aretha Franklin is a legend. This is her story. Aretha Franklin has lived a remarkable life and has put that life back into her music. Aretha's voice is full of honest emotion, full of passion and pain. This voice doesn't just sing soul, it is soul. Aretha Louise Franklin was born in Memphis, Tennessee on March 25, 1942, the fourth of 5 children. As a young girl, she and her family moved north to Detroit. Aretha's mother, Barbara, and her father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin, split when Aretha was just 6. Aretha was shattered when her mother died 4 years later. The Reverend C.L. Franklin was left with the responsibility of raising Aretha and her siblings. The Reverend C.L. Franklin was one of the country's most powerful black preachers. In the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, Reverend Franklin became famous for his recorded sermons on the Chess label and his nationally broadcast radio show. As pastor of the New Bethel Baptist Church, he was so compelling at both sermonizing and fundraising that he was known as the man with the $1 million voice.
And how successful you are in your efforts.
The Reverend Franklin's big brick home welcomed many of the greatest political and artistic leaders of the time, including Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, Art Tatum, and the Reverend James Cleveland, who even lived in the house for a while. The gospel singer Clara Ward was a close family friend and a big influence on young Aretha. Clara's uninhibited gospel performances inspired Aretha to sing. Aretha taught herself to play the piano with help of her father's musical friends. The handsome Sam Cooke was a particular inspiration to the shy young girl. Aretha often entertained her father's friends, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Dr. King was a family friend, and Dr. King's favorite song, as far as I know, was Precious Lord. And I know that he used to ask Mahalia to sing it all the time, and whenever I had the occasion to see him and I was singing, he would ask me to sing Precious Lord.
Even with all the musical legends around her, Aretha's best music teacher was her father.
I think that my dad felt that I was gifted or uniquely talented as a child, yes. He would coach me in different things. He would give me different records to listen to and to see if I could emulate them on the piano.
Her sisters Irma and Carolyn became her musical accomplices. No one knew her better. Aretha is an introvert, Irma said, and really comes alive only on stage. Each of the sisters would grow up to cut her own albums, but Irma and Carolyn never stopped singing with Aretha. The 3 sisters' collaboration would last for life and result in some of Aretha's most powerful music. At 12, she sang her first solo in the New Bethel Baptist Church. Soon, she was a featured soloist playing piano for the choir. At 14, Aretha made her first recordings, which were released on Chess Records in 1956. In her early teens, Aretha started performing on the road with her father's revival show. "We never went hungry except for when we were on the road," Aretha said. She endured the indignities common to black performers at the time, arriving exhausted in a town to find that you couldn't eat in the segregated restaurant or walk through the lobby of the hotel because you were black. When she was 15, Aretha's world turned upside down. The preacher's daughter was pregnant. She dropped out of high school and stayed at home, listening to music and playing the piano, getting lost in the blues of artists like Dinah Washington. After the birth of her son Clarence, Aretha grew restless. She realized that if she didn't get out of her father's house now, she never would. Many Baptists felt that crossing over from gospel music to the secular pop market was a betrayal, even a sin. Aretha turned to her father for guidance.
I decided I wanted to change fields, so I let him know. And he felt that this was what I wanted to do, and this is what I should do.
The Reverend Franklin encouraged Aretha to follow the example of her friend Sam Cooke, who successfully crossed over to pop music. Aretha would use her voice to spread the good news in a different way.
I think there was some conflict in the church congregation concerning her crossing over. They felt to some degree that she was turning her back on either the church or on God by singing secular music. However, my father played quite an instrumental role in elevating the people's enlightenment.
Reverend Franklin helped Aretha cut a demo with his friend Major Mule Holly and accompanied her to New York. Aretha prayed that she would succeed in crossing over onto the pop charts. This time, her prayers would be answered.
You know, Aretha, we hear from so many young people constantly around the country who think this is a glamorous business and that it happens just overnight. And I want you to tell about your background, because so many of them ask me, you know, how do you get started in this business? What did you do? And I want you to tell them what you did.
Well, I used to travel with my father, who is the Reverend C.L. Franklin. He records for Chess, by the way. And I decided I did want to switch from gospel to pop, so he took me to New York. We made some demonstration records in Detroit, and after we got to New York, we started leaving them at different offices, and in turn, I got a contract with Columbia Records, and it just started happening.
The 60s were to be one of the most turbulent and exhilarating decades for America, and for Aretha Franklin. In New York, her demo, Today I Sing the Blues, caught the attention of Columbia Records' legendary A&R man, John Hammond. Hammond was a visionary. He had signed Billie Holiday when she was around Aretha's age.
Aretha Franklin was brought to me by a songwriter called Curtis Lewis. He had a demo of about 8 different people doing his tune. One of the people who did was Aretha Franklin. I listened to this. I said, this is the greatest singer I've heard since Billie Holiday. Where is she?
Aretha's old friend, Sam Cooke, created a bidding war by urging his label, RCA, to sign Aretha, but Hammond got her for Columbia.
Well, everyone in town's got your number, and everybody's got you pegged right. Is that why you got in touch with me? I guess you must be running out of fools.
Aretha's 6 years at Columbia were an apprenticeship. She recorded show tunes, big band jazz, and blues. She had not found her true voice. She was still painfully shy and spent many sessions singing to the floor. It was on one of her regular visits home to Detroit that she met Ted White, who would become both her husband and manager and partially replace her father as the center of Aretha's life. Trying to control Aretha, Ted White drove away several associates, including John Hammond and her later producer, Clyde Otis. Otis said Ted saw her as a jazz singer and would continually ask Aretha to tone down rather than cut loose. Aretha valued her musical heroines. So when Dinah Washington came to see her perform and declared, "This girl has got soul," Aretha was elated. 2 months later, Washington died. Aretha was devastated. To express her grief, she cut a moving tribute album, 1963's Unforgettable. The next year, she had more cause to mourn. In December 1964, Sam Cooke was shot to death. It was more than the death of another musical hero. It was the loss of a good friend. With the star she had followed gone, Aretha would have to find her own path. By the mid-60s, a new youth culture was bursting up from underground. The charts were conquered by Motown and the Beatles. Record companies scrambled to tap into this new market.
Ladies and gentlemen, from Detroit to Hollywood a go-go, Aretha Franklin!
I wanted to keep us to a degree as a jazz singer, but Columbia wanted to make a big pop star out of her, which I thought would ruin her integrity.
Unfortunately, Aretha's Columbia recordings failed to attract a big audience. Her songs were played on the radio occasionally, but they didn't fly into the record stores. Aretha wanted a real hit record with a sound she could call her own. But Columbia and Ted White only seemed to want to tame her intensity. Meanwhile, at Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun and Jerry Wexler were pioneering an urban electric style of rhythm and blues. In 1967, Aretha's contract with Columbia ran out, and she made the move to Atlantic.
We at Atlantic always were an R&B and rock and roll company. So it was natural for us to try to get out of Aretha the great talent which lay dormant up to that point.
Aretha and Columbia, they weren't exactly sure what to do with her, and they tried a lot of different things, but they didn't find the essential thing. And it was simply a matter, I thought, of giving her a setting which would bring out whatever that thing is. It's called gospel, it's called soul, it's called rhythm and blues, and not to gussy it up with adornment. Just let it be very simple.
Over the objections of Aretha's husband, Ted White, Atlantic producer Jerry Wexler took them down to Alabama to record at Fame Studios with the Muscle Shoals rhythm section.
I wanted to bring Aretha to Muscle Shoals because I thought that the Muscle Shoals rhythm section would be the best way to jumpstart her, because they are some bad, funky white boys who play the deepest R&B and blues that you could possibly imagine.
Ted seemed more displeased than Aretha that the Muscle Shoals musicians were mostly white. Aretha sat down and started to play. She had already worked out the arrangement at home. When her fingers hit a soulful chord and her voice swooped, the Muscle Shoals players ran for their instruments and rode her groove. At the end of the session for I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, everyone knew they had just cut a classic.
Loved a man the way that I love you.
Unfortunately, the magic didn't last.
While we're in the middle of all of this, of working on song number 2, there was a famous altercation which, as Casey Stengel used to say, you could look it up. It's in the books.
Harsh words between Ted White and a musician he said was a racist redneck escalated into a night of shouting and banging doors. First thing in the morning, Aretha and her husband flew back north.
Everything scattered. We all went home. Everybody went back to where they came from. And we were supposed to do an album, supposed to be there for a week. We did 1 1/4 songs.
Jerry Wexler returned to New York with the music and some of the musicians. If he couldn't keep Aretha in Muscle Shoals, he would bring Muscle Shoals to Aretha. There was one problem. Aretha was nowhere to be found. She was having problems with Ted White and taking it hard. I Never Loved a Man was getting great response from DJs, but Aretha was so deep in hiding, Wexler couldn't tell her. When Aretha finally emerged, he whisked her into the studio to complete the B-side, the majestic Do Right Woman, Do Right Man. Now he had a two-sided single he could give to DJs and put in stores. Recorded in a blaze of emotion, I Never Loved a Man became Aretha's first million seller, sizzling up to the top of both the pop and R&B charts. Talk of Ted White's abusive behavior had made it into the pages of Time magazine's 1968 cover story on Lady Soul. The magazine reported that Ted had roughed Aretha up in public and depicted her as a very unhappy woman. Aretha was distressed at this exposure of her private life. From that point on, she refused to discuss her personal life with the press. Soon after, Aretha quietly and privately ended her marriage. Once Ted White was out of her life, Aretha never again had any official manager other than her brother, the Reverend Cecil Franklin. Happier days were beginning, and with Atlantic behind her, Aretha would soon create music that would shake the world. With Aretha's marriage on the rocks, she briefly slipped into depression. Atlantic, her new record company, had a hard time coaxing her into the studio. But Aretha had waited for her chance too long to miss it, no matter how much she was hurting. When she came back, she brought all of her complex and conflicted emotions into the studio with her. For Aretha, the move to Atlantic Records was all about finally finding her own identity as an artist and a woman. In a burst of creative fire, she made the most passionate music of her life. In 1967, Aretha released 5 top 10 singles, including I Never Loved a Man, Baby I Love You, Chain of Fools, and a song written especially for her by Carole King and Jerry Goffin.
When my soul was in the lost and found, you came along to claim it. I didn't know just what was wrong with me until your kiss helped me name it. Now I'm no longer doubtful of what I'm living for, and if I make you happy, I don't need to do more, because you make me feel, you
Expanding on the rich harmonies she'd worked on with her sisters, Aretha also sang with Cissy Houston and her Sweet Inspirations. Cissy would bring her young daughter to the studio. Aretha became a big influence on little Whitney Houston, who would grow up to record with her. Aretha still turned to her sisters for inspiration. Since childhood, Aretha, Irma, and little Carolyn had developed a unique empathy. Jamming around the piano, it was Carolyn who added the catchy Sakatumi refrain to a song originally written by Otis Redding.
This song is a song that a girl took away from me. A good friend of mine. This girl, she just took this song, but I'm still gonna do it anyway. What you want, honey, you got it. What you need, baby, you got it. All I'm asking for the respect when I get home. Hey, girl, hey, hey, hey. Hey, now, ooh, Lord.
Ain't gonna do you wrong while you're gone. Ain't gonna do you wrong because I don't wanna. All I'm asking is for a little respect when you get home. I'm about to give you all my money. All I'm asking in return, honey, to give me my profits when you get home. I want it when you get home. Yes, I do.
With respect, all the forces inside Aretha Franklin came together. In an era of rebellion, when every different American community was looking for a seat at the table, Aretha's voice became a clarion.
Aretha, as Dr. King Jr. would happily present you, I present to you this plaque saying that you have done to our people and to this world a great service that have made us feel that we are somebody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody in the house. And if you feel that I brought this service to you, my father brought it to me.
As the civil rights movement won victory after victory, Aretha's father continued his close relationship with Dr. Martin Luther King. The Reverend C.L. Franklin was Dr. King's constant support. Reverend Franklin even organized Dr. King's march down Detroit's Woodward Avenue in 1963. One of Aretha's greatest honors came when Dr. Martin Luther King flew to Detroit to present her with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Award. The occasion was a February 16, 1968 concert at Detroit's Cobo Hall. After the show, Aretha was loaded with awards, and Mayor Kavanaugh declared it Aretha Franklin Day. 2 months later, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated.
Precious Lord, Lord, lead me on.
At his memorial service, Aretha performed his old favorite, Precious Lord, the song she sang for him as a child in her father's living room.
And we all get tired. And God knows we get weak. And every day
In the wake of the King assassination, riots ripped up American cities. The country was convulsed by Vietnam, hippies, and Black Panthers, civil unrest and assassinations. Popular music was becoming tougher in content and tone. Aretha knew that she had to plug into that energy. In a series of concerts at the Fillmore West, the hippie crowd turned onto Lady Soul.
So I brought her out there with great trepidation because I'm thinking this place with all the Fillmore posters and the gels, the light things, you know, and the crawling amoebas, and the smell of patchouli, and all these stoned out hippies listening to this funky black music. I thought we were hatching a disaster. But was I ever wrong?
The subsequent recording, live at Fillmore West, had a high point in a spontaneous jam between Aretha and the great Ray Charles.
Come on home, y'all. Because I feel the spirit. I got to find me a woman tonight. Because I feel the spirit.
As the 60s gave way to the 70s, Aretha's winning streak continued unbroken. She recorded This Girl's in Love with You, Spirit in the Dark, and Young, Gifted, and Black, some of her strongest and most personal albums.
Don't play that song for me, 'cause it brings back memories of days that I once knew, of those days that I spent with you. Oh no, don't let it play. Oh no, fills my heart with pain. Please stop it right away. I remember just what he said. He said, no.
Aretha Franklin.
The Queen of Soul began to add the prestigious Grammy Awards to her many accomplishments. Beginning in 1967, she captured the title Best R&B Performance Female 8 years in a row. By the early 70s, the award was being dubbed the Aretha Franklin Award.
Thank you, Jerry, Arif, Tom Donald, Cecil, Ruthie, LaRue. Hi, Daddy. Thank you.
All right, Peter.
4 singles in a row certified gold in 1971 and 72. Bridge Over Troubled Water, Daydreamin', Spanish Harlem, and Rock Steady.
Rock steady, baby, that's what I feel now. Let's call the song exactly what it is. Step feeling from side to side. Sit yourself down in the car and take a ride while you're moving. Rock steady, baby. Won't call the song exactly what it is. What it is, what it is, what it is. It's a funky load I'm feeling. Can I hear some heavy right? What it is, I might be doing. This funky.
During this period, Aretha traded her gowns and high heels for African head wraps and robes. Her image was a powerful boost for African American pride. But Aretha never forgot where she came from. She returned to gospel with the album Amazing Grace. It was a profound experience for Aretha to record once again with her father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin and the Reverend James Cleveland, and to hear Clara Ward wailing in the background. The album's photos of Aretha outside the church were shot by her companion, Kenneth Cunningham, the father of her 4th son, Kelf. Amazing Grace became one of the biggest-selling gospel albums of all time. Then, just when her home and career, her spiritual and secular sides had all found a balance, Aretha found herself singing at loved ones' funerals again. This time, it was her musical inspirations, Mahalia Jackson and Clara Ward. With the last of that generation gone, it was up to Aretha to carry on their spirit.
Gotta find me an angel.
As the 70s continued, Aretha lost direction, starting with the album Hey Now Hey, The Other Side of the Sky, produced by Quincy Jones in 1973. Despite treasures like The Poignant Angel, composed by her sister Carolyn, it was not as big a hit as Aretha's earlier albums. It was time to try something new. It was a more glamorous Aretha who took Stevie Wonder's Until You Come Back to Me to #1 on the R&B charts.
Well, I'm gonna rap on your door, gonna tap on your window pane. I wanna tell you, baby, changes I've been going through. Missing you till you come back to me. That's what I'm gonna do.
Unfortunately, in the mid-70s, the hits were fewer and farther between. Aretha was not alone. The war was over. The Black Power movement had quieted. America's period of upheaval was ending, and popular music became less about changing the world and more about dancing and partying. The rise of disco caused many soul artists to drift. Aretha's low stretch was broken by her collaboration with Curtis Mayfield on the 1976 soundtrack Sparkle, with its sexy hit, Something He Can Feel. For most of her career, Aretha battled with her weight. But in that period when her music seemed less urgent, she looked thin and glamorous. She was a legend now, and took some pleasure in the attention. In 1978, Aretha married for the second time to actor Glyn Turman. She liked to call her new husband, my own Dr. Feelgood, and relished being mom to their combined household of 7 kids, cooking soul food in their Los Angeles mansion. Family was always important to Aretha, and while she was happy in Los Angeles, she still phoned her father several times a day and relied on his judgment. Aretha's personal life was happy, but her music was trailing a poor second. The glory of Aretha's Atlantic years fizzled out, as her last 3 albums for the label failed to crack the top 40. But her career slump was nothing compared to the news Aretha received in 1979. Her beloved father had been shot in his home by a burglar and lay in a coma. No news could have been worse. The rock on which she had built her whole life was crumbling. Aretha knew she had to go home. Aretha Franklin's father was the center of her world. Soon after a burglar's bullet left the Reverend Franklin in a coma, Aretha abandoned her marriage to Glyn Turman and her glamorous Los Angeles life and returned with her sons to Detroit. From that day forward, she stayed as close to Detroit as possible. After a bad flight in 1983, she developed a fear of flying so severe, she refused to ever get back on a plane. Aretha was badly in need of professional resurrection. Her comeback began when she signed with Clive Davis of Arista Records. The first stage of Aretha's revival was a show-stopping cameo in the Blues Brothers.
Don't you blaspheme in here. Don't you blaspheme in here. Now, this is my man. It's my restaurant. You two are going to just walk right out that door without your dry white toast, without your 4 fried chickens, and without Matt Guitar Murphy.
Clive Davis found a series of hot producers for Aretha, kickstarting her renaissance with Luther Vandross on the album Jump to It in 1982. The single went to #1 on the R&B charts, and the album went gold. Aretha was back. But again, Aretha's public success was marred by personal tragedy. After 5 years in a coma, her father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin, died on July 27, 1984. Aretha was shattered. Aretha had spent a fortune on her father's health care, and the state of New York chose that moment to sue her for back taxes. Aretha's closest friends and family worried that she would never recover from this tragedy.
We all were looking at her, you know, saying, oh, she's going to fall apart. We know it, you know, because she'd had her own, you know, problems before then. And we just thought she was going to really go into a fit or going, you know, go off, really. I really expected her to go off. But she she really handled it quite well.
Aretha rose above these tribulations and went on to the greatest commercial success of her career. Her sassy side shone on Who's Zoomin' Who, an album that framed Aretha's voice in a hip 80s context. She made her first pop video for Freeway of Love, which won her 12th Grammy Award. Her duet with Annie Lennox, Sisters Are Doing It For Themselves, was a smash, a sort of respect for the 80s. Who's Zoomin' Who went platinum, scoring 5 top 40 singles. Remarkably, Aretha was at her commercial peak 25 years into her recording career. Her home state of Michigan proclaimed May 23, 1985, Aretha Franklin Appreciation Day, declared her voice a natural resource, and renamed a central Detroit street Aretha Franklin's Freeway of Love. Aretha followed Who's Zoomin' Who with an album called Aretha. A duet with George Michael on I Knew You Were Waiting For Me gave Aretha a record-breaking 17th top 10 hit. The album also included a remake of the Rolling Stones' Jumpin' Jack Flash, produced by Keith Richards. In January 1987, Aretha became the first female artist inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
What can I say about Aretha? I mean, you're in, baby!
Riding on this unprecedented success, Aretha fulfilled a dream and produced a gospel album. One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism, at her late father's New Bethel Baptist Church.
Previously to being in the pop field, I was a gospel artist. And so my roots are in gospel. And wherever I go, I take the gospel with me, and I will always return to the gospel.
A family affair, the album featured preaching by the church's new pastor, her brother and manager, the Reverend Cecil Franklin, as well as appearances by Aretha's friends like the Reverend Jesse Jackson and Mavis Staples, and harmonies by her sisters Irma and Carolyn. It was to be the three sisters' last recording together. Aretha nursed her baby sister Carolyn through a long, brave struggle with cancer. Carolyn died in 1988 at age 43. She'd composed some of Aretha's most poignant songs and sung with her all through her life. In December of that year, Aretha received another blow when her brother, the Reverend Cecil Franklin, died. Each loss made Aretha cling more firmly to her family and home.
On a day I was born, said my father, said here's an elegant.
In a very short time, she had lost her father, her sister, and her brother. The world looked at Aretha and saw a legendary star enjoying a great comeback. Those close to her knew how much pain she was going through. There had always been a great difference between the face Aretha showed the world and who she really was. As the 80s ended, the distance between the private woman and the public figure had become a chasm.
Look to the rainbow. Looking out on the morning rain, I used to feel so inspired. And when I knew I had to face another day.
Although her shyness made her a reluctant diva, Aretha Franklin formed a soul connection with generations of music lovers. In her 1993 duet special, a new generation of female singers paid homage to Aretha, just as she had once looked up to Mahalia Jackson, Clara Ward, and Dinah Washington.
Still make me feel
Aretha Franklin's life has been full of suffering and pain, but she has endured the loss of her family members and friends and braved career setbacks. In 1994, Aretha topped off her 15 Grammy Awards with the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences' ultimate honor, the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award.
I'd like to remember my father, Reverend C.L. Franklin. Thank you. Who first acknowledged and recognized my gift. I'd like to look back and remember my brother Cecil, who walked with me for 20 years as my manager and as my friend.
In 1998, Aretha experienced yet another creative renaissance. When Luciano Pavarotti became too ill to perform at that year's Grammy Awards, Aretha stunned the world by stepping in for the opera legend and performing Nessun Dorma. It seemed that there was no music Aretha could not make her own. The same year, she released a groundbreaking album called A Rose is Still a Rose. For the title track, Aretha teamed up with Lauryn Hill of the Fugees. It was a song of advice from a wise older sister to a naive girl. Time magazine declared it her finest record in 20 years. Most critics agreed. Forever overcoming setbacks and losses, constantly open to change, the unbeatable Aretha Franklin will always be the Queen of Soul.
The preceding program is copyright cleared for use in the classroom and is presented commercial-free on the first Tuesday of each month at 4 a.m. Eastern Time as part of Cable in the Classroom, a public service of VH1 and your local cable company.